Beth is the one who was organizing it along with Karen. It's March 11th, so we'll keep you posted via Facebook and with that. We made some changes this time for the Medicine Action Dinner, so please feel free to give us your feedback on the carpool combos, how those went, how they could be improved. Woohoo! Yeah. The reading that we passed out beforehand, the required reading, which I'm sure you guys love since you have nothing to read in medical school or school in general. And then we're also trying to live stream this and post a video afterwards. So if you have any feedback from that, we'll see how it goes. We're working on the bugs. No promises.
Where's the camera?
Yeah, you guys are going to watch it.
Oh yeah?
Yes.
We also wanted to, a lot of us here are from Rush, but we wanted to see who here was not from Rush and say welcome. Thank you for coming. So I know we have some people from UIC. If you guys wouldn't mind just raising your hand. Great, thanks for coming. We're excited that you guys are going to be hosting.
Are there any other schools?
Any other schools? We had a few that ended up canceling kind of last minute. So.
Just wanted to check, make sure we miss you guys.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Welcome. We're excited you guys are here.
We wanted to plug two events before we get started. SNAP, Students for National Health Program, is holding a Single Payer 101, which is actually more of a universal healthcare. Can it actually work in the United States, and why should we have it talk? On March 17th, St. Patty's Day, for full disclosure. It's going to be at 6 o'clock, and Dr. Ansel is gracing us with his presence to give it, and we're actually having chilongos, so for all of y'all who know
It's a precedent. It's never happened in Rush history, I don't think.
we're blowing all of our budget on it, so get really sad. And empanadas. But anyways, so we're going to be talking about what's been actually a very polarizing issue for this political season, single payer. What is it? Why should we have universal health care? And Dr. Ansel's going to go through all the details and stats on that and talk about it. So we're really excited to have him giving that, and it's going to be at 6 p.m. again on the 17th. So we'd love to see you guys all there. We're going to have a mixer. Loyola is actually coming out for that, so if you also want to meet Loyola, we'll be around too. So we'll have a mixer afterwards on Taylor Street.
Some very good jokes, too. I can promise you.
Green beer.
Yeah, Midwestern couldn't be here tonight, but they are hosting a conference, and it's called Students in, what is it?
Student Interventions in Health Inequality.
Student Intervention in Health Inequality. It's at Midwestern on March 12th from 10 to 4:30 p.m. And I think the idea behind it is sort of what are the skill sets that students need to address inequities. And there's a lot of things when we step out to do things that you realize, oh, I have zero experience. It's like getting in front of people and giving a talk, or writing something about policy, or writing an op-ed, or doing things that require you to take your ideas and passions and put them into action. And so that's what I think this is. It's kind of an all-day workshop for med students. So Ashley, I don't know if people know Ashley from Midwestern. She's an M2. Slazornik. We have her contact information. And what I'll do is I'll send you.
We already posted it on
You got the
Facebook for you
brochure
guys.
already.
And I think we'll send it out via Google Group again.
Yeah.
But it's going to be great. Ashley's phenomenal at organizing, so it's going to be really good. So without further ado, we want to introduce Jamie Kalven, who we're very honored to have here with us. He's a journalist and human rights activist. He started the Invisible Institute, worked on the Citizens Police Data Project, and most recently has been talking about the release of the Laquan McDonald video, which was related to the shooting. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. So I hope and I understand from the tradition of this group that we'll be having a conversation. So I'm going to say a few framing things, and then we'll go at it. And you'll ask me questions, challenge me, we'll have an interesting conversation. So let me start with the present and then do a little time travel just in terms of my own work and how I started working on the issues that have pretty much consumed me in recent years. I'm working on a piece now, we were talking about it, with a couple of very, very rare individuals, one of the rarest things in the city, 2 whistleblower police officers. It's extraordinarily rare when police officers sort of break ranks, and there are reasons for that, and compelling reasons. And we can talk later about the code of silence that sort of enforces silence and adherence to an official narrative on police officers. But one of them said to me recently, sort of reflecting on the state of affairs in Chicago right now, that we live in a broken city. This is a police officer talking. We live in a broken city. And what she was describing was a set of conditions where there are really significant parts of the city, large areas, neighborhoods, populations, who want nothing to do with the police, who will not cooperate with police investigations, who, under circumstances that the rest of us would call 911, don't call the police, have developed alternative public safety systems of various sorts as a way of not interacting with the police. And so that's on one side. And on the other side, we now have a police department that is, in its own way, kind of traumatized. In the last several months in Chicago, but maybe over a longer period nationally, in this sort of extended post-Ferguson period, we find ourselves in, the police have experienced a kind of Copernican revolution in their world and how they understand their job, what the parameters of the job is, what's expected of them. So right now in Chicago, there are police officers taking just trying to be helpful. There are police officers are sort of fully vested in their pensions after 20 years, but generally stay on beyond that. So police officers are taking early retirement in disproportionate numbers. Good officers, the kind of officers you want in your community, are asking to be reassigned and put behind desks, something they would have resisted in the past. And above all, officers are trying to avoid being first on a call, and being maybe the next video that goes viral, or being in some situation. So communities, and often communities where there's the most violent crime for a variety of reasons we can talk about, that don't want to interact with the police, and a police department that substantially doesn't want to interact with communities, and a lot of bodies are falling in between right now. And I think you probably heard in the media about just the number of shootings since the first of the year, and the number of homicides and fatalities. So we live in a broken city, and I think, if anything, I just want to emphasize that theme tonight, because this is a moment in Chicago of the most severe and challenging sort of reckoning with conditions of structural violence that just are not some kind of crisis. It's just the society we've created. This is the nature of the society we've created. And at the same time, and everybody's lived through this who's been in the city, we've had this extraordinary political upheaval. And so there's a historic opening for really fundamental and enduring reform. So, possibility, grave stakes right now. And part of the reason I like the formulation, we live in a broken city, is it sort of captures the sense in which we all live in a broken city. This is no longer just an issue for the communities where patterns of violence are concentrated, and where most concerns about police misconduct and police abuse come from. We all live in a broken city, and because of my involvement in the Quan McDonald case, and identification with these issues generally, in the midst of this, I've been constantly in media, constantly giving talks, and talks that range from, church basements in African American communities to civic, boardrooms and muckety-mucks in the city, and everywhere people are trying to gain a perspective on happening and trying to figure out what their personal responsibility is in the midst of it. A particularly interesting question for doctors and doctors to be. But we live in a broken city, and the stakes are huge right now. And the issues that we're dealing with, and I'll come back at this, from another direction, are really the great fundamental, it's the great fundamental unfinished business in American life, around race, around conditions of racial inequality and exclusion. And there's no way to address sort of discrete issues of police accountability and patterns of retaliatory violence in certain neighborhoods without ultimately talking about race and addressing those fundamental conditions of inequality in our society. So, that's the present moment. Immense stakes, an unprecedented historic opportunity, but, this great challenge that we have with respect to this kind of blood knot at the center of American life around race, where we can know things and not know them at the same time. Things can be in plain sight, and we can manage to tolerate the intolerable for other people. I was thinking driving over here, just in terms of, your training and your expertise and perspective. If you might find it interesting to go to this website we've created. I was the plaintiff in a Freedom of Information Act case, Kalven versus Chicago. I don't like titles very much, but I like the name of that case. That established in the spring of 2014 the principle that documents pertaining to allegations of police misconduct are public information. They belong to the public, subject only to a few reasonable redactions. We don't want to see a police officer's social security number, but we want to know his or her name. We want to know, assignments and all sorts of other information about the officer and complaints against the officer. So we got this, really substantial amount of data as a consequence of the decision. We're going to get lots more. The city has agreed to give us the disciplinary data for every officer to serve in the police department back to 1967. Right now we have the last 4 years, and we're together with the city, we're engaged in a fight with the police union, which will win, and we'll get this huge amount of data. So if you go to the site, which is called the Citizens Police Data Project, if you Google it, you'll easily access it. You'll be greeted by a heat map of the city. And the heat map reflects where the complaints come from, highest concentrations of complaints. It won't surprise you that the highest concentration of complaints come from the Black South Side and the Black West Side. If you were, and we're going to do this in the course of the year, maybe some of you would be moved to help us, because public health information would be really important.
Actually, I heard from a documentary that it's not them, it's actually more of a Caucasian population that complains more.
Well, we can come to that.
Yeah.
We can come to that. That was probably from our data, because if you were to look at the sustained rate for complaints, as opposed to where the volume of complaints are coming from, you would think that, and those are the cases that are judged to have merit and where officers are punished, you would come to the conclusion that by far the most common victims of police abuse are middle-class whites. So it's part of the inversion of the whole, that whole universe. So, but overwhelmingly the complaints come from low-income African-American communities. And if you were to look at the map and were to import other data sets into the map, so if you had socioeconomic information, school outcomes, public health information of various sorts, measures of abandonment, vacant lots, foreclosures, boarded up buildings, and obviously the rates, the incidence of personal violence and the lowest clearance rates by the police. We know, we're going to demonstrate it, but we know it would all align. So, police abuse and various patterns of violence some places and not in other places, to some people and not other people. And it's highly, highly, highly patterned, and it's in plain sight. And yet we can manage not to acknowledge it, not to see it, not to describe it, as it is. I should say about my own sort of experience with these issues that, I only talk in these terms because of a sort of long journey that began with very little clarity, but just a sense as someone, and this is really in the sort of mid-90s, this trajectory in my life. As a writer, I'm a professional writer, so that's what I do, but never really fully satisfied with just being a writer. Some need to be a citizen in an active sense as well as, and over time that practice has become one thing, but it just felt like a restlessness. And I wrote a lot for The Nation at a certain point in my career, and there's a danger with writing. Writing's hard. I don't know if it's hard for you guys. It's hard for me. And so you finish an article urging action on other people for the end of social change of one sort or another. And it's easy to feel, having written that article, because it was hard to do, well, I've done my part. And I think a lot of writers, and particularly progressives and on the left, I think it's possible to fall into that. And I didn't want to be that person, and also have a certain kind of appetite for the world and for a kind of sort of sense of adventure in my work. When I was younger, I was a mountaineer and climbed all over the world. Mountaineering and the need a certain kind of edge and risk, and I'm a native of the south side of Chicago, and I emerged from a book project that had been pretty consuming, and my work moved more and more, both as a writer and as an eccentric sort of organizer, towards just exploring the place where I lived. I live on the south side in Hyde Park, grew up on the University of Chicago campus. My father was a professor there. And, I've always sort of struggled with this sense of living in this enclave in what now it's, relatively depopulated. But when I was a kid, the south side of Chicago was the biggest contiguous, black community or patchwork of communities in the country, and extraordinarily interesting place, but also very balkanized in terms of boundaries that people observed as if they were moats with crocodiles in them, or thick, castle walls, and they were just in people's heads. And so my sort of personal exploration and my work took the form of really exploring the idea of what it might mean to be a neighbor under conditions of urban apartheid. I was very influenced then and now by the movements in Central Europe against totalitarianism. So, in the 70s and 80s, I think probably the thing you'd be most likely to be familiar with is Solidarity in Poland, but there were similar movements in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere that were really inspired, and I think there's a lot to be learned from them, where under conditions, these kind of glaciated societies under totalitarianism, where citizenship was a kind of degraded condition, just to salute the state and assent to the state in various ways. They came up with it, and also armed struggle or uprising was not viable because you would be crushed. They came up with this incredibly elegant sort of strategy of saying, let's just behave as if we're free. Let's just behave like free people, as if citizenship mattered. And what that meant for, Lech Walesa and Adam Michnik and that meant was things that we completely take for granted, like writing a letter to the newspaper, holding an open meeting. One of the things that became very volatile was going to monitor trials, public trials of dissidents. Extraordinary acts of courage that also, over time, created space for more and more activity. So it was a notion of not cozying up to power and not seizing power, but sort of generating power in civil society. Right? And I was always very taken with that notion of behaving as if we were free, and sort of seeing what happened. And so what drove me from the early 90s on in this kind of compelling place that is my home on the south side of Chicago. I'm a native. That's where I grew up. I have that sense of being placed and attachment, but also these sort of racially coded boundaries and sort of geography of fear that too often people just by their own behavior sort of reify. This idea took hold of what would happen if we behaved like neighbors under urban apartheid, and that gave rise to a whole sequence of initiatives that I either participated in or created that mostly used physical work as a medium for crossing boundaries and remapping the South Side for myself and colleagues and people who were drawn to it. So, one project involved was cleaning up and creating gardens. There's a whole federation of community gardens in Woodland right now that sort of grew out of this, cleaning up vacant lots, boarding up abandoned buildings, but doing it in a kind of barn-raising spirit, where you just sort of build relationships with a church group, a block club, whatever organized infrastructure, and come with a pickup truck full of tools and say, let's, see that rock over there that's in everybody's way? Do you want to move it? If you want to move it, you bring some people. And using physical work as this kind of medium for relationship building, because the other thing I should say, and this was something that we still act on in our work, is this, and it's pretty fundamental for my colleagues and myself, is we have all this easy talk about a national conversation about race, a national conversation about peace. A good conversation assumes a substructure of relationships and a common language. And I think, the fundamental thing in American life is we have neither the relationships nor the common language to have the conversations that we desperately need to have, both privately and publicly. So our work has been, and mine in particular, has been really focused on not presupposing that conversation is available to you before you build the relationships, and be prepared, because that conversation is so precious and so important, to make a disproportionate investment in building the relationships. And I use physical work. I like to do physical things, and I think there are a lot of people who can kind of assess each other's character through work more readily than through self-presentation. It's a language, it's a medium. And so we would do these sort of barn-raising volunteer, and that gradually evolved into an employment program I created called the Neighborhood Conservation Corps, which ultimately took the form of creating employment opportunities for young men in the criminal economy. Mostly that meant drug dealing, or just coming out of prison and looking for traction somewhere. And also the work gravitated, and everything, sometimes when I talk about this, or really when other people talk about it or write about it, it looks like it's this sort of heroic or reckless or quixotic jump across great chasms and social nothing in my life has been like that. It's always been maybe some sense of direction, and then just putting one foot after the other, small steps, small choices, that over time may end with you somewhere you never expected to be. And so the form that ultimately took for me is I ended up through this process spending close to 15 years immersed in public housing on South State Street. Some of you may have memories or have heard, and it has now disappeared as completely as the Warsaw Ghetto has disappeared. But there was an extraordinary concentration on the south side of Chicago. It was elsewhere in the city, but huge on the south side of high-rise public housing that was torn down between about 2000 and 2008. Most of it was torn down. And on the south side, there was something called the South State Street Corridor of Public Housing, which extended for well over 2 miles from 54th Street to Louis Fifth Street, and then some smaller developments further on. And it was the biggest concentration of public housing in the country and the biggest concentration of poverty. And at the northern end of that corridor was a development, most of it was the Robert Taylor homes. At the northern end was a development called Stateway Gardens between 35th and 39th State Street and the Dan Ryan. And 8 square blocks to the south side where I, in this step-by-step life's an adventure way, ended up spending 15 years. Incredibly impoverished, embattled community, sort of like a South African township in terms of its relationship to the rest of the city. And there's in the language of journalism and sociology, it's almost like an inevitable construct where people talk about isolated urban poverty. Isolated urban poverty. If you were to Google those words, you find a gazillion instances of it. I think that is a sleight of hand. That is a complete sleight of hand. These aren't isolated places; they're abandoned places. And abandonment states a relationship. Isolation is like poor people moved away from.
Or passive, which is like it's raining today.
It rained today. Abandonment states a relationship. So I want to just place Stateway Gardens for you. And this was somebody in the 90s, some sociologist or political scientist, looked at the 1990 census, and actually there were national stories about this, determined, and this was kind of bogus analysis, but because I'm sure there's a lot of competition, but determined the Stateway Gardens, those 8 square blocks, was the poorest single community in the country based on the poorest census tracts. It certainly was, extraordinarily poor. Although one of my dear friends there, who was a resident leader, whenever I would make that point, would correct me and say, we're not poor, we're broke, which is a temporary inconvenience, but they were really broke, and and also embattled. So I'll talk about the policing of communities like that. When I first started working there was a big story on the Tribune, on the front page of the Tribune, that there were more murders in the police beat, which is a small area, more murders in the police beat that included Stateway than in 4 states in the previous year. So utterly abandoned, embattled place. But let me place it. 35th to 39th, State to the Dan Ryan. Directly across the Dan Ryan was, it used to be Comiskey Park where the White Sox play. Now it's U.S. Cellular Field. Directly across 35th Street, Illinois Institute of Technology. We used to joke in those days, it's not a term in currency right now, but we used to joke that we discovered the precise location of the digital divide. It was 35th Street, with Stateway on one side and IIT on the other. More telling in terms of, the themes of our conversation tonight. As of 2000, it was a block and a half from the administrative headquarters of the Chicago Police Department. It was a block and a half from De La Salle High School, very well equipped parochial school, where both Mayor Daley the First and Mayor Daley the Second, were students. The agency that it was then called the Office of Professional Standards that investigates allegations of excessive force and racial ugliness by police officers, was located at 35th and State in Mies van der Rohe high rise there. So just imagine this, that's abandonment. There's all this institutional capacity, and you have this population living in like boat people, offshore, but they're not offshore. They're in the midst of the city, and so there's a sense in which a city like Chicago, each of us creates the city. Each of us creates the city as we move through it by where we direct our attention and what we allow to be visible to us and what we don't, and with huge consequences for the health and welfare and human prospects of people living in places like Stateway Gardens. So through this odd route of my own, Stateway became like a second home to me. I spent more time there than I spent at home, much to the chagrin of wife and family. I had an office in one of the buildings, a 5-bedroom unit where we were sort of squatters. And if you came to visit me there, and I always urged people to do, I would have given a talk like this in those years, but I wouldn't have gone downtown to some office and talk to people. I always insisted that people come on site if they wanted to talk to me. You would have come, and drug dealers would have acted sort of as doormen. Oh, you want to talk to Jamie? And would sort of usher you in through the open air drug marketplace that was in the lobbies of the building. This is all within the sight of the superintendent of police. So it's just I may be belaboring this, but I think it's a really important point. We live in a world where there are these intimate landscapes, intimate geographies that contain vast social distances. And the consequences of that, allowing those distances to exist for, as I say, the health and life prospects of people are immense. So my work, in a curious way, and remember, I'm a writer, and I do these other things, but it's mostly in the service of being a writer and trying to make certain things visible and inquiring into them. My work has been, I think, in all sorts of different ways over the years, addressed to the kind of disconnects, trying to attack and subvert the disconnects that human capacity to see and not see, to know and not know, to move through an environment where stuff is in plain sight and somehow not see it, in the belief that if we can collapse those distances, we can be diagnostically smart. But as long as we maintain a set of fictions about the world we're moving through, we're kind of stupefied, and we can't be effective. So the work at Stateway was really my personal, I don't want to say laboratory because that sounds cold, and this was a community that ultimately received me with great hospitality, and they're people I loved and relied on, and have been in the trenches with. But it was an amazing setting in which to explore a set of themes about the inequality that we seem to have an almost genius to live with and tolerate. And so my insistence was just to be there every day. Was to be there every day, to be helpful in the ways I could be helpful. We had this quite robust organization in which I was the only person without a felony, history, but that was really inspiriting for the neighborhood. Gave hope to people to see young men who had been, in some cases, warlords in the drug hierarchy doing this kind of work. And there were two. In the era of monolithic gangs, the gangs, referred to themselves as nations. So there were two gang nations. The black disciples and gangster disciples controlled different buildings on the south side and up and down the South State Street corridor. And I actually hired out of both gang nations. So there was a running joke that we were a multinational force. But the part that wasn't a joke was there were two people in particular who used to shoot at each other, and not in the abstract. I mean, actually, shot at each other from their different gang perches, who ended up working there was power in it, and we, this was just about jobs, and it was about repairing this abandoned community. But for me, deeply, there was an underlying nonviolence agenda, and so it was an instance of putting down guns and picking up tools, and doing it in the setting where everybody was looking on. High-rise public housing, was acres and acres of vacant land, completely uncultivated, unimproved, with towers. And so there were always all sorts of people looking on, and it was part of the power. So there's a multiplier effect within people's families, their kids, but above all, their cohort among the young men in the criminal economy see this. And it was so successful in its way. I mean, it's, small ghetto business, a couple of pickup trucks, and going from job to job, but it was so successful. And not because of me, but because my colleagues, it was so sort of sexy in the way they carried themselves, that I could not, there came a time when I couldn't go anywhere in that part of the South Side without young men leaving their posts in the drug trade to come up and ask me for a job. And these were jobs that paid, something more than minimum wage, but not much. And swinging sledgehammers, heavy work, you got dirty. So, there's a hugely unrealized set of possibilities. The notion that people want to, stand on the corner. Next time you go by some guys, dealing drugs on the corner, just look into their eyes. They are so bored. Seriously. I mean, if you just think about it, working conditions, they're bored to death. And we had this sort of middle class narrative about this being all exciting and, at least it's dangerous and, all that, juice associated with it. That's not the reality at all. And the wad of money in the kid's pocket is not his. And it's just, looking at their jaundiced, bored eyes. So we became a kind of alternative. And guys would come out of prison with, sort of crackly, brittle, parchment-like newspaper clippings where they read something about, this enterprise and thought, wow, that's something I could, sort of shyly approach you. I'm going to digress and tell one story. I'm going to shut up in a minute. We'll talk about the police, but there's one story that just floated back into my head from that era. It'll give you some of the flavor of it and also the delicacy of some of these relationships. So we were working on a job site, and I think creating a garden or something. When you create a garden on a vacant lot in Chicago, it's really, really heavy work because the practice in Chicago with demolition of buildings is just to dump the building into the foundation, in the basement, and it's allowed. So you pass the costs on to anybody who's going to build on that lot, but mostly nobody builds on it. So when you go, 6 inches in south side or west side, 6 inches down, you're likely to find a radiator or great slabs of concrete. So it's really, really heavy work, and so we're doing this work. And there was this big slab of concrete, must have been a porch or something, that was right where we wanted to create this raised bed. Something had to be done with it, and and a guy comes, again, just out of prison, and really, extraordinary physique. A lot of guys stay sane and healthy in prison by working out all the time. So really, really strong, and very, very shyly came up to me and asked if I had any jobs, and I was very careful always not to create hope, not to create false hopes that we couldn't realize. And I said, give me your information. We sort of create jobs one at a time, stay in touch, and he was gracious about it. Walked away well. When I turned around, he had picked up a sledgehammer and gone to work on this slab, and he just wailed away on this slab. It was extraordinary. And the guy's working with big tough guys, and we were all in really good shape from all the physical work, and this guy was just awesome. It was sort of John Henry, it was amazing. And worked away, and we're all sort of in awe. Came over to me and put down the sledgehammer and very softly said, "What did you think of my resume?" So so that was sort of the flavor of this, of this enterprise. And we had fun, and there was a sense of freedom. One of the things about working in abandoned places that nobody cares about, and people do feel this, and there are all sorts of personalities that thrive on it. Is there's a crazy kind of freedom because it's abandoned. So there was if residents wanted to do something, wanted to try something, we were game, and we had some capacity, and we did some public healthish things too, just in terms of being a gateway for people who had different kinds of services to provide to residents. So I was immersed in that setting, and was working on a book for the first 4 or 5 years I was involved there. So I wasn't writing about it, but I was immersed. I was building relationships. And by the time I came to start to write about the conditions, I had an extraordinary set of sources, because they weren't sources. They were friends. They were people I knew. They were people I had history with in this place that nobody, any reporters who ever came there just sort of parachuted in because there'd been a shooting and left. So, had built a set of relationships, and also just had become a presence and a fixture in the environment. And I have to say, I didn't see the patterns of policing as clearly initially as I came to see them. High-rise public housing back in the day, this was an amazing environment, so much to take in, and so stimulating. And I was mostly addressing physical conditions in the development. But over time, as a middle-class guy living in Kenwood on the south side, began to and residents were sort of educating me about a set of patterns with the police. The first thing is nobody called 911 for the police to come, because they just would not respond. There was no expectation. This was policed like a township in South Africa, where it was a strategy of containment, just to keep it within the township. If it spilled out, there was a need for intervention, as seen by the authorities. It was also a vice zone, so it was a place where drugs were allowed to be sold, basically. And there was a kind of shadow play of enforcement by the police, but it took this ridiculous form of, it was called hitting the buildings. Gang tactical officers would drive up on the sidewalk and jump out of their cars, and the young men would run up into the buildings, and people, it was just, and it happened multiple times a day, but it wasn't, effective enforcement. What became more and more apparent was there was a whole other set of dynamics of police who fed off the drug trade. And I'm now writing a piece about a major protection racket that existed in public housing, where a group of 5 or 6 gang tactical officers over a 10-year period exacted what was called on the street a tax from drug dealers to deal drugs in a particular building. And it was as much as $50,000 a week in a building. I think it was $5,000 at the height of it, $5,000 per drug line. And there could be multiple lines in a single building. And they would provide protection against intervention, by the police disrupting the drug trade, and they would target the competition of the drug dealers and then seize drugs and feed them back to the drug lines. In effect, you had a group of police officers, and this was widely known within the department, so there are other people in the Division of Spoils and looking the other way, who were an integral part of the drug trade on the south side. But again, because of the abandonment, because nobody cared about these communities, they had a great high level of impunity to do this. I never saw that in those years. I heard about the tax, but I never saw that. But what I did see on an almost daily basis was excessive force. There was, you rarely saw an arrest that didn't involve physical violence by the police. There were police who, got off on it and, would grade each other on the blows they inflicted. Petty corruption, so routinely officers coming into these open-air drug lobbies and taking drugs and money off the young men but not arresting them, to the point where residents used to joke about the open-air lobbies as being a policeman's ATM machine, where you just you need a little money for your house note or and just come and take it and say, well, that's your bail money. You can bond out here or down at the station. It's your bail money. Routine, daily, brazen. But for me, the most telling thing was the small things that just, I now use the word impunity as a really active part of as this really important analytic concept in looking at patterns of abuse. I knew the word then, but it wasn't an active part of my vocabulary. But what I was seeing from day to day in the most visceral way was impunity. How people who are disposed to be abusive in one way or another, corrupt, brutal, racist, wretched towards women, will behave in a setting, in a space where they know they're not subject to being identified and punished. And it often took, small forms, the sort of language that was used, sometime over, police loud, the PA systems on the cars, hood rats, the N-word, just used in a completely unself-conscious way. And a kind of perverse pleasure in toying with people, just doing, ugly sort of things just because you could toy with people. We were talking about torture earlier, and I think, torture is seen and justified as having this sort of instrumental purpose. We need to get the information and all of that. I think we don't often enough talk about just the space and license for human perversity that is allowed by these kinds of practices. So I witnessed this. I began to write about it, investigated homicides, rapes by the police in this setting, and tried to evoke this other reality of it's like another constitution or an apartheid justice system. But remember the geography. Chief with sort of major institutions of the society, but treated so differently. And the question that took hold, and I'm going to stop a minute, and we can, as we say on the South Side, conversate about this. But the question that took hold for me, and it has driven the work, including the Klein McDonald reporting and the database we alluded to earlier. The question was, and in a way, it has analogies to doctors think. I think I'm not a doctor, but know some. Is this we're observing this? I'm observing these harms from day to day. I know as much as I know, my own children. This is true. This is real. This is happening, and this is over years. And I'm, a trained observer. I'm documenting. I know that this is true, and so the question became, what set of institutional conditions would have to exist for what I'm observing day to day to be the case? So the reality had been established, and I actually think this is the essence of a certain kind of human rights work, that there's always a danger of getting caught in abstractions. And we talk about police, we talk about accountability, transparency, impunity. These were very useful words, but the critical thing to remember is that these patterns, the structures of inequality and exclusion are at a bedrock level, are enforced by particular blows from particular hands against particular bodies. And in a way by chance, and now I think wholly faithful in how my work and my understanding of my work has unfolded, that's kind of where I started. I didn't start with the abstractions. I started with an experience of those particular harms, and then pursued the question with absolute knowledge that this was real and was the case, kind of working up an analytic chain of trying to understand the conditions that would allow this to be the case. And so with colleagues at the University of Chicago Law School, we ended up bringing, in those years at Stateway, I think half a dozen federal civil rights suits, one of which culminated in getting with Steve Whitman as an ally in it. We got lots of documents from the city in the course of discovery. I intervened in court on behalf of the public, asserting that these documents were public information and shouldn't be under seal as they were. And that just sort of set in motion a sequence of events over again. that culminated in March of 2014 with the Kalven versus Chicago decision, establishing the principle that this category of information, these sort of documents, belong to the public. And a great deal has sort of flowed from that. But anyway, that's sort of my backstory. And thanks for indulging me in telling it, because I think it's sort of, I've been in the midst of this media storm because of the Laquan McDonald stuff, and it's helpful for me just to recover my own ground, which is, back at Stateway Gardens, in this immersive experience. And if there's, I'm very loath to give advice, because I think, we each have our own path, and the more eccentric the path is, the more likely it is that it's going to be fruitful for you, I think. But I guess I would just emphasize that one theme, that I think there's a danger of assuming we have relationships we don't have before we have them. And that there are things that only can be learned once you've built those relationships. And there's a kind of immersive work, and I think it's something that, among the people I've talked to over the years who have seemed just sort of existentially in a similar place. I remember during the Stateway years, doctors and ERs, for example, just sort of, there are these places where you find yourself with a point of access to fundamental things about the society, but you experience them in an immediate, visceral, consequential way, and not as abstractions. And then the question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge? Where do you take it? How do you share it? But for me, that having that bedrock, we had a publication from Stateway that was quite effective in those years, that we called The View from the Ground. And there are things that you can only learn on the ground. And I don't know about medicine, but in terms of public housing policy, policing, there's this really pronounced disconnect between observable reality on the ground and a sort of policy discourse that can go on at a sort of mid-level abstraction. And so I guess, in sharing with you, I'm sort of locating my own conviction that there are a lot of different kinds of knowledge, but there are certain things that you actually can't think your way through. And that's not to say it isn't important to think, and that sort of engagement on the ground and immersive engagement can yield forms of knowledge that really aren't available to you by other means. So let's open it up, and any questions, thoughts? Yeah.
I guess the reason why I made the comment earlier was because I have a lot of friends and colleagues that are middle class to upper class, and that didn't grow up in diverse urban settings. And because of the data that was published, I guess thanks to you, many of them are saying, well, look at that. It's middle class white Americans that are complaining more, and not these urban, poor state or underserved communities that you talk about, Angelica. What do you think about that? And then, I look at them and I try to explain, well, most of these communities don't seek refuge to 911, police officers, the police department. I'm like, they're the ones that mainly are creating violence in their community. And then they're just like, well, research doesn't show that, and you love to use research. So what
Go
would
to
you
our
say?
website. You can push back
like
with our
that.
website. But one thing you're saying, I think, is really important to remember. And so we have this website, and it's been celebrated nationally, written up in the New York Times. Nobody's ever had as much of this kind of data. And there's a danger with data. There's a danger with data, it seems to me, that people think they've got the world. You sort of got your arms around the world. When you've got something really, really fragmentary, you've got a splinter of the world, and this is an example of that. So we have all of thousands and thousands of citizen complaints. In most of these communities, and I do interviews about this all the time, the vast majority of people who feel that they've been abused never complain, because they believe, and we have the empirical evidence to show that they're right, that it'll be unavailing to complain. You know, it's not a hospitable process, and the statistics are staggering in terms of it takes an incredible alignment of stars and planets for a complaint to ever be sustained. So there's a huge ghost phenomena out there, that, and that's why you can't rely on just the data. You need people on the ground, sort of learning that. There's one Department of Justice study that I think is flawed and probably understates the phenomena, that suggests with respect to excessive force that the ratio is about 10 to 1 of people who feel they've been the victims of excessive force to those who actually file a formal complaint. But you know, it's really clear, the patterns in the data are really clear, that police abuse happens in certain neighborhoods. And the other thing that's really powerful about it is that it happens in the context and the orbit of the war on drugs. There's a huge amount of license that's allowed, and so our criminalization of whole populations has created a lot of space for abuse. A lot of our work has been directed, our colleagues and myself, at deficiencies in the oversight of the police, supervision, investigation of complaints, the disciplinary systems. And all that stuff's important, and we're talking about a lot in the city right now. Those systems need to be fixed. And this, comes back to race and comes back to the sort of fundamental. And so, those deficient systems do create impunity. If you think you have very little chance of being punished, people who are inclined that way will do it. Overwhelmingly, the thing that confers the most impunity is the social status of the victim. The social status of the victim. And so radical inequality creates so much space for this kind of abuse, including the sort of, just sort of casual cruelty and toying with people. Why? Because you can. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that starts in high schools, because I worked for 8 years in 2 high schools in Bronzeville, Dunbar, and Phillips.
Phillips, yeah, I know.
And what you talked about, I was right there in the schools. The very same thing. This code of silence, this criminalization, the way they treated the students,
Yep.
the way the police treated the students in the school. I mean, you just wouldn't do that in another school. So when you talk about the neighborhoods, the school was the same way.
Yeah.
And when I was there as a healthcare provider, there was no one to talk to, because this silence, they just didn't pay attention to anything you had to say. There was no way to go. And the teachers were in these little isolated schools. Yeah.
I think what you say, and I think there's a parallel here to your question here. What's really, so I want to just maybe paraphrase or shed it. So by immersing yourself in it and beginning to see the invisible, you're aware of something that you were not aware of before deeply, and then you back up and you can get the data that just substantiates what you found to be true through your experience. And I want to just reinforce this in about even sort of figuring out how as young people becoming doctors and nurses or PAs or other things like that is, you want to live an integrated life in which you can live a life in which you're, the ideas that you have and how you act on them are actually tied together. So one thing is, what's your name again? Angelica. Is part of it is you have to stop trying to convince people who can't see to see. You know what I mean? I just given up on that one. But I haven't given up with pointing out the ways that we need to act together, whether it's in solidarity or in partnership and collaboration around these ideas. One of the things that's very striking, and I'm just going to, for those of you who have been to other MIAs, what broke this, what allowed Jamie to break open this, get the videotape, was the autopsy. And the autopsy was done by a doctor who painstakingly described the bullet wounds.
Actually, if you guys are interested, look at, the article, I mean, I've now received, I'm going to receive more journalism awards for an article on this story, and it's very ambivalent for me because I would rather not have this on my resume. You know, it's such an infinitely regrettable, ugly incident. But the autopsy was absolutely central. So if you Google Slate magazine and my last name Kalven, there's an article, the title of which was 16 Shots. Now, you know, I flatter myself in thinking young people are shouting the title of my article in the streets.
We did too.
Yeah. Well, that's where I started.
The dying, right?
I'm the first, the first person that wrote those words. But it was based on the autopsy. And, you know, you guys probably know, I want to come back to your point later, but, you know, I think probably the broad outlines of the Quan McDonald story are familiar to people. October 20th, 2014, you know, widely but very briefly reported, like most of these incidents are. It was reported that at 41st and Pulaski, 9:45, 10 at night, a 17-year-old boy with a knife, acting strangely, lunged at a police officer, and the police officer shot him in the chest, and he died sometime later. And, you know, a rather colorful account of this was given to the press by a guy named Pat Camden, who's been a longtime spokesperson, first for the police department, later for the police union, always at the scene of these events, giving the police narrative. And it was dutifully reported by the press. What's really telling, and hasn't been much reported, is that the police department at 3 a.m. the following morning put out a press release, which is an extraordinary kind of Orwellian document in its use of language, that basically the narrative is, you know, a young man with a knife, you know, aggressive towards the police, lunges at the police and causes his own death. You know, all of the language is designed very carefully carefully crafted in the case of the press release to attenuate any agency for the police officers and assign agency to the victim. This was the prevailing narrative put out by the police. A colleague and I, a lawyer who represents me and we've long worked together, he got a call and transmitted the information to me from somebody we know in law enforcement in the city about a week or 10 days after the incident, who said, this was a terrible case, you know, it's terrible what happened. It's completely at variance with what was reported. He was the first person to tell us there was video, you know, the dash cam, now famous dash cam video. And he said, I have no confidence that it's going to be vigorously investigated. I think they're going to just deep six the video and, you know, 18 months from now, they'll issue a finding that this was justified shooting. So at that point, and he also gave me enough, it was fragmentary, but enough information, I was ultimately able to track down a civilian witness to the shooting, a motorist who just happened to be stopped by the action and had an unobstructed view of what happened. So I then began investigating this case and knocking on doors, and I remember probably within 2 weeks of the shooting, standing at 41st and Pulaski, and it's kind of amazing to reflect back on that from this perspective when Laquan McDonald has become a name like Emmett Till, you know, by this amazing public narrative that will be with us. I mean, it's just now this huge narrative, and I don't claim credit for that. You know, that was something that was kind of extraordinary that happened. But I remember standing at 41st and Pulaski and thinking, you know, what happened here? What happened here? And it's an amazing, I don't know how well you know the city, but you know, this is the southwest side of the city, and it's really kind of the city of broad shoulders, you know, the big truck yards and industry. The expressway, there's an exit off the expressway, the trucks constantly. You can see the skyline in the distance, so it feels like, in some ways, the middle of the city and the most desolate place, you know, imaginable, the other side of the moon. And at 10 o'clock at night, and I stood there at 10 o'clock at night as well as during the day, you know, it's completely deserted, completely desolate. So the sense in which this boy was executed in the center of the city, and you know, in this utterly distant, alien place. In any case, to come back to the autopsy, so the first big break in the case is a civilian witness who was terrified of police reprisals. I mean, really, really honorable guy, but he was so horrified when I showed up on his doorstep. I mean, I don't know what the medical equivalent of this would be, but one of the hardest things in being an investigative reporter is you inject yourself into people's lives who did not ask to be public figures. You know, the fact that this guy happened to witness an atrocity and then behaved honorably in terms of reporting. The police on the scene shoot him away from the scene without taking a statement. He, on his own initiative, ultimately went to the city and told them what he had seen. But he was also very frightened of police reprisals. I mean, imagine seeing something like this, what we've all seen on the video, seen it just as you go through your day. Well, they're capable of anything. You sort of think, what would happen if so I showed up on his doorstep, and it was raining. You know, he was maybe a mile further south on the southwest side of where the shooting occurred. And he's the most gracious, hospitable man, but he was so appalled to have me show up. No, anyway, so our first conversation, it was about 20 minutes. He was standing in his doorway and not inviting me in. I was standing in the rain, and we were having this conversation. I'm very, very calm and even keeled in tense situations, and so I'm doing my calm, reassuring thing. And he just is so fundamentally decent as I'm getting wet that he can't not tell me the story. You know, he just can't not tell me what happened. So his first telling, he's told me, you know, after that we developed a relationship, and now we're actually, you know, friends. And he couldn't not tell me. You know, it's just there's something. Somebody said to me recently, who's done a lot of work with whistleblowers. You know, there are people for whom it's kind of a choiceless choice. They just can't not behave. Right. The people that they are honorably. They just can't be themselves and not do that. My whistleblower is like that. She just can't. She can't be otherwise. But it can put you in great peril. But it's not like you choose to be brave or something. It just is who you are. So that was, you know, and his account was detailed and vivid, and ultimately completely aligned with the video. So for me, the video was just corroboration. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a game changer. And I think we can talk more about that. I think there are dangers in our sort of valuing video over other kinds of evidence. You know, how do we know? I mean, I think if the corollary of seeing is believing is not seeing is not believing, then our overvaluing of video, and I say this as somebody who played a pretty central role in the release of this video, I think the danger is our overvaluing of video can kind of aid and abet denial. I mean, how have we known things? What kind of evidence, you know? So in that context, the autopsy was really the critical piece, much more important, I think, overall and in retrospect, I think it proved to be, than the video. I mean, the video set in motion the media frenzy, but it was the autopsy that utterly impeached the official narrative of what happened, and did it with this extraordinary care, you know, painstaking care and authority of the medical profession. And my Slate piece, which I'd urge you to read now, I'm not promoting my work, but because we're talking about the autopsy, is, you know, begins, the beginning of the piece is an autopsy tells a story. And so it's based on this, really the conceit of the piece is that Laquan McDonald was able to testify to by way of the medical examiner to what in fact happened through this process of the autopsy. And, you know, the piece goes through every 16 gunshot wounds, front and back, remember the official story that the city had doubled down on multiple occasions was young man lunges, shot in the chest, dies sometime later. So at that moment, and it was February, almost a year before things, imploded, February 2015, when the article came out, everything was in plain sight. But the extraordinary thing about the autopsy is in the midst of these unstable narratives and huge investment in a fabricated and false official narrative, the absolute uncontrovertible factual basis of the autopsy was incredibly powerful.
And just, I don't know, who was here when Jack Raba was here? Raise your hand. Some people. Some of you here. So Jack Raba, who was the medical director of the county jail, when a doctor who I knew from residency, who was incredibly thorough, called him up on a Saturday. Jack lived in Oak Park, this town, and said, I have a guy here who was brought in by the police, and he's got burns on him, and he's got markings that look like he's been tortured. And Jack, who didn't have to do this at all, and most people wouldn't, went down to the jail, left his kid, it was a softball game or something, went down and examined.
The hardest thing for a parent to do.
Went down, I'm just saying that the parallels to this, because this was now 20 years ago, went down, corroborated that these were like this, actually wrote a letter to the chief of police that outlined what happened. The next call he got was from the chairman of the Cook County Board, who said, stay out of it. And this letter led to, criminal conspiracy by the police, of the police torturing black men on the south side of Chicago to confess to murders they didn't commit and put them on death row. The point I'm making is that doctors doing their work, and nurses doing their work in witness, and making the invisible, what seems to be invisible, but it's totally visible, visible in ways like this is what we have the opportunity to do in our work. And guess what? It finds you.
Yeah.
You don't have to go looking for this. You don't have to go to Stateway to find it.
Yeah.
It will look for you. And the idea, so I think the point is that's, these MIA dinners that we've set up, and now we'll maybe proliferate with U of I doing them, but things that happen in the ability to join hands together around this. I think the other thing it takes is not doing it alone. When you're alone in that school as a nurse, and you just are witnessing suffering that everyone's ignoring, then you end up suffering yourself. We all suffer we all suffer from this. But when you have a group that you can work with, whether it be students and others, and I just want to sort of, and Jamie knows this, at the last MIA dinner, out of the release of the tape, got organized a die-in in front of City Hall by medical students from around the city. And that got a lot of national attention on this. And I'm just saying that one can't underestimate what we do by saying what we see.
Yeah. And there are actually a couple of points that I want to just emphasize. One is I hadn't really had that perception. I knew about the sort of medical information in the Verge saga, but these are the two biggest, the two most sort of defining issues of state violence in modern Chicago history. The history of police torture, coerced confessions, and now the Quan McDonald story, which is significant in itself, but also just emblematic of these larger ongoing patterns of structural violence. And in both cases, along with all sorts of other efforts and strategies, in both cases, the sort of definitive information that doctors were able to provide, remember my image of sort of the bedrock reality of particular blows against particular bodies being the essence and the nature of these larger structures. That's how they're enforced. It's doctors who uniquely have the ability to describe those harms. There were two things I wanted to sort of circle back to. One was just, your moving evocation of the kids at Dunbar and Phillips. We have a project now that we call the Youth Police Project. My colleagues and I, again, if you go to the Invisible Institute website, there are a bunch of videos of my conversations with young people on the South Side. And the focus of that project has been, again, in the same immersive way I was talking about Stateway. So we spend a whole year with, a dozen or 20 students at Hyde Park High School, Hyde Park Academy. We've done this for 4 years running, talking with them, doing role plays, other kinds of inquiries together. But the focus is on their interactions with the police. And they're not the worst thing that ever happened, but daily interactions and what comes of those daily interactions. I've learned so much from 17 and 18-year-olds in the course of that. And the kids start, when we start this process, and again, we invest a lot in building the relationships. They're, particularly the boys, they're kind of enveloped within the phenomena itself of these, the interactions with the police. And they have certain, attitudes and ways of expressing things to one another about it, but it's kind of a given world. They're inside it. They don't have much critical distance. And over time, we build conversations with them. And as they come to realize that they actually know things that other people would benefit from knowing, and that we're truly interested, it's not just some performative thing. We're really curious and interested. Extraordinary conversations come, and they're extraordinary. But one of the things that and so towards the end of the process with, each of them sits down one-on-one with me to do, in a studio setting, to do an extended conversation, which is videotaped. And we've been the President of the United States has seen them. They've been used in training police officers, because you have these kids just at that point so thoughtful, so sort of measured, so reflective about the consequences for them of constantly being stopped by the police. And it doesn't have to be a terrible beat down. It doesn't have to be like Juan McDonald. The routine in our kind of apartheid justice system, the worst things that ever happened actually are present in the daily small encounters. I used to think, and I've learned this from the kids, I used to think of it as this sort of linear continuum where at one end you have just nastiness and rudeness, and at the other end you have John Burge and Laquan McDonald. But in fact, one of the things that I learned from the kids is the worst things actually inhabit the small things, and they're reinforced and reenacted and reproduced in the small things. And the way they express it, this is a distillation of things that scores of kids have said. What they say, in effect, each in their own voice and inflection, that when we go into an encounter with the police, when it happens, we try to avoid it always different ways, but when it happens, we go in knowing two things. The first is they have all the power. And so, what I was describing in terms of impunity and the things that police do and get away with, and people know that in neighborhoods because they see the same jerks coming around all the time, whatever efforts they've made to get rid of them. They have all the power. And if something goes down, if this interaction derails in some way, we won't be believed. We will not. And it's just fundamental, axiomatic. The kids live with this. The kids you were with at Dunbar, that's what they live with. But it takes a kind of imaginative effort, really, to get into that reality of what that would be like and how different it is from at least middle-class expectations moving through the world. So I'm going to finish one point, and then, one of the ways I put it to people is, let's imagine, I don't know why, you could choose all sorts of different settings, but for me, imaginatively, Haiti under Papa Doc, Haitian government under dictatorship. So in Haiti, there were police, a security force for the dictator known as the Tatamaku, who had distinctive dress and there were horrific stories, people disappearing, rape, cannibal, it's just really frightening stories. And Tatamaku means boogeyman. It comes out of folklore of, you tell your little kid if he's bad, Gunnysack, Mr. Gunnysack, I think is what it was. So let's imagine some combination of us are in Haiti under Papa Doc, and we go to a nice, Creole restaurant and enjoy each other's company and come out in the evening air, and two members of the Tatamaku come over and ask us for our passports and our papers. And they walk away for 15 minutes. And then they come back and give us our papers and say, sorry for the inconvenience, hope you enjoy your stay in Haiti. That's a harrowing experience because they have all the power. And if something goes down, we won't be heard. That's a harrowing, and I don't think it's an extreme analogy to the corrosive effect in a world where John Burge has, it took decades and decades to get even a modicum of public acknowledgement.
With the city defending.
With the city defending.
Overt torture.
If it wasn't for an almost magical set of circumstances, nobody would know the name.
City defending. 20
20
years later, right?
Nobody would know the name.
Well,
Laquan
and in
McDonald. Yeah,
the case of John Burge, there was the key journalist as well.
Yeah, John, my friend.
Conroy.
Yeah, John
Yeah.
Conroy. So, and also, interestingly, not the Tribune, not NBC, not
Right.
independent journalists. Just moving. And I think that's one of the lessons in this. I'm not sure quite how to frame it, but but think about that Haitian parallel, because we have a justice system, we have a criminal justice system, again, in the context of radical inequality, where people are daily, and the young people you were invoking, are daily being instructed in their powerlessness. And then they are making choices based on that. If you can't trust the police, if you can't trust civil authority, then other kinds of alternative public safety systems take hold. The gangs are a lot of things, but very significantly, they're a public safety regime. It's archaic. You read the Bible, read the Iliad. You mess with me, my people are going to mess with your people. And so a lot of the cycles of retaliatory violence we see are not just the perversity of the inner city, the way it gets characterized with subtext. It is a direct byproduct of, to go back to the initial image, our broken city, where people have been educated, like your students, in not trusting not just the police, but civil authority, the whole civic order. You had
I want to, let's say, one
you
more
had a question,
and then
sorry.
I know we want the kids.
Oh,
I swept past your
I didn't
question.
have a question, I
Yeah,
just
a
gonna make
comment.
a statement, so if someone had a question, y'all can go ahead.
If
But-
you have a question?
I have a question.
Okay, go, you got a question.
It's a little bit of a different direction, though. So you mentioned growing up around the University of Chicago. Could you talk a little bit about the U Chicago Police Department? I know it's one of the largest private police departments in the country and maybe the world. And their responsibility is to serve the students of the university, but often that comes at the expense of the residents of the surrounding neighborhoods and perhaps students of color who go to the university. Just maybe you could talk a little bit
I
about
can. I've actually had a role in negotiating with the university on behalf of the community about the University of Chicago Police. And you're right. It's I think the second or third largest police force in the state. It's a private police force, and it has a parameter or jurisdiction well beyond the campus, and it exists because of anxieties, within the university that are very kind of racially coded about crime and danger, and it's also part of the university's promotion of itself as a safe place to send students and for faculty to come. And it's a very problem. I'm having a meeting tomorrow with the vice president, or not tomorrow, Tuesday, with the vice president who oversees the police, and we've negotiated about this. It's the principal there are a lot of community concerns. I mean, I should say that the communities where they're active, south of the university and north of where I live in Kenwood, want more police resources. I mean, they want the police there, and that's the paradox of poor black and brown communities is they're under-policed, at the same time they're over-policed, and so people want the sort of services from the police that other citizens of Chicago have, but they're forms of harassment, just presumptive, the fact that you're a black teenager in proximity to campus and you're just suspect, whether you live a block away or you're a student. So there are constant, instances of the sort of micro insults, and sometimes more than that. So yeah, no, it's a serious problem, and the push that I've been involved in with them is really on two fronts. One is, we established this principle of transparency as a legal matter with respect to police misconduct. And the university is actually making the argument, which I think is completely untenable, that they should not be subject to the same transparency. And because they're a private institution, but they're a private institution performing a public function. And it seems to me that the same expectations of transparency follow. I'm pretty sure as a legal matter, we'll win that in court. We're trying to negotiate so that they agree to it. But it's a real. But then the other thing that I've been urging on them, I don't know, you from the South Side? You seem to be familiar with it.
No, but I went to school at UC.
Oh, at the UC, so you know it from that perspective. Yeah. So the other thing is, and I've been urging this on them, and I think we're getting a little bit of traction, is they actually have this really interesting opportunity right now, because it's a police force of a couple hundred. They have the campus, but then they've got sort of the Woodlawn area, Grand Crossing, and then North Kenwood. A lot of the sort of consequences and patterns that we've been talking about in terms of abandonment, disinvestment, and so why not actually have a completely, there's something at the university that I find intellectually corrupt called the crime lab. It's really problematic. Gets lots of money and is very closely allied with the city. And this kind of bogus evidence-based policy formation, but it always sort of works. It's like the fix is in before they do their research. But what about having a kind of incubator for exploring these issues in an academic setting, but having the police department and its day-to-day workings pay attention to it, look at it.
Who's it stopping? Making it public.
But we're doing it. I mean, that's the process we're engaged in, and then thinking about it and being open about it. I mean, these are, so there's a scandal of police misconduct, lack of accountability, all of that, and then there's some really interesting sort of underlying issues about what a healthy public safety regime would really look like. So why not make it an incubator for developing those sorts of ideas? There was one other thing I wanted to push off from something you said, David, about certain kind of practice in your work. I think of what I do, and you've gotten a taste of it tonight. I think of what I do as active inquiry, and it involves intervening in the world, but also in a spirit of inquiry and reflection and perception. So, I've always found it really striking, and I've mentioned Havel before, and Adam Michnik in Poland, and I've read a great deal of Gandhi and King, and what interests me, I mean, obviously they're inspiring and all of that, but I'm more interested in the way in which they are brilliant sociologists. They're engaged in inquiry. Gandhi's autobiography is called My Experiments with the Truth, or Experiments with the Truth. And I think it's descriptive, and that it's for real. And I said before, there's certain things you can't just think your way through. And I think I can explain a little better what that means. If you can't feel a sense of efficacy and agency, no matter how small it might be, there are issues that are just anguishing to think about. I mean, the condition of really confronting and reckoning with some of the fundamental destructive, life-stunting and destroying conditions in our society and elsewhere. To think about those things and learn about them without some degree of agency is really difficult. And I think we all have this sort of genius for denial. And I live in a neighborhood, I suspect you guys do, and medical school, where I'm surrounded by people who, many of them dear friends, who I have no doubt of their character and moral sensitivity, who read 3 newspapers a day, starting with the New York Times, have NPR on all the time, read the right books, and are completely ignorant and morally stupid about conditions of life within walking distance. I mean, how do we do that? It's really kind of amazing that we're capable of that. And I think one of the ways to push against that in your own, and I don't mean that people are callow and heartless and lack empathy. I think it's just really hard to focus on harms and think about them and really take them in imaginatively if we don't have the means to act. And so I think there's a sort of feedback loop between action, however modest. I'm not talking about grandiosity here. I'm talking about cleaning up a vacant lot. But there's a feedback loop between action and perception, and by being able to act, you can perceive more, and by being able to perceive more, it comes to inform your action. And when I think about what movements are, movement is such an interesting word. So what moves when a movement moves? It seems to me that that's what moves. That feedback loop between action and reflection, and the reflection and your access to perception making you capable of more action. Anyway, I wanted to say that because I think a lot of what we've been talking about touches on that theme. So that notion of active inquiry, and I mean it in the most rigorous intellectual sense, as well as the most personally necessary sense.
We're going to move this conversation to more informal, because I know we have, some other announcement. I know a group is formed at Rush on gun violence, and I know that they want to speak to this.
I think we have one more comment.
Do you want to make a comment, please?
I just kind of wanted to first off, thank you for coming to speak to us and kind of opening this, and then I guess just kind of putting this out there, kind of as a challenge and reflection of us all, is to me looking at all of this and all that you speak of to me, the running theme for me is kind of our preconceived conception of an us versus them, and is operating in separate entities when we're all in really one American system. And until I feel like we actually identify that it's not their problem, it's a problem within the system, and when it within any operating system there's a breakdown, it's going to eventually affect the whole. We study the human body, we see that if something happens ever so minor pathologically, just the smallest, even if you want to take it down to the biochemistry level of P53, you know what I mean? The smallest thing if it's continually ignored within the system, can wreak a cancerous havoc. And so when you think about that, and as you challenge yourselves and you go out, and I love that you were talking about inquiry, always ask yourself and check yourself as you're going through things, and remember why we all kind of came into this together, because I'm sure somewhere in personal statements and as you apply for residency, it's because you want to in some way, shape, or form make a difference, help change the system in some sort of way, even if you don't live to see the fruits of your legacy. So I think that in going that as M1s and M2s, I mean, I know thankfully we have in my school UIC, we have the urban medicine curriculum to balance all your math and sciences. But I feel like I'm a firm advocate of you will perform how you've practiced the whole time. So during your M1 and M2, I know you want to get the great grades and the strong science foundation, but don't forget about everything that happens beyond the clinic that is affecting your science foundation, and start pulling those thought processes while you're studying your pathology. When you hit your third year clerkships, practice how you perform and asking some of those questions of not just turning a blind eye. For example, we learned in these past couple weeks, even in terms of domestic violence in Illinois, it's not a mandatory screening here in the state, whereas other people, where it's just us as physicians, it's uncomfortable in the system, so we ignore it and don't talk about it, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. So as you get out there in your third year clerkship, start asking those difficult questions, because if you continue to do it, one day it will not be hard for you to ask. And then as you continue to move on in your career, I mean, I'm not a physician, but I'm learning to do some of these things and hoping to continue those and seek people and mentors who do that, who can train you so that you have the perfect habits, to not see it as an us versus them type thing, but as an us problem that we kind of work at this together. And I don't say that to like target those who are not black or everything, because I have to ask myself that too. I sometimes even have to reflect within my own self as an African American to not look at it as an us versus them, because contrary to some people's belief, like I grew up middle class. Probably my background and experiences as an American is probably more similar to some of you guys than someone on the south side of Chicago. So it's just like you really have to continually reflect on that until it becomes innate, until one day, who knows when, we can see the beauty of the, it's not us but them, but one healthy, harmonious American system.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And I wanted to piggyback on, so that inquiry goes on all the time, and that advocacy that you can do by trying, you cannot put yourself in another person's shoes, but you can say that I can't imagine what it's like to be in your shoes, but you can be a witness to it. You can try to understand it by asking questions, and you can be an advocate for it. And we shy away from that, and we shy away from it because it's painful when you enter into that suffering, when you realize it's immense suffering going on there. When you, in that moment of witness, you end up experiencing yourself. But the other thing that we can do, and I reinforce this, is we can take action together. And they can be small actions together. You know, the last one was the die-in, right? It was feeling so pained, and the power of the video is making visible what's visible day in and day out, but suddenly visible now to the people you're talking to. Do you know what I mean? That video, but the idea of being able to take action, because unless you, just like practicing inquiry, you have to practice action. And sometimes that action is pure old speech, okay? But other times it's actually action. But it needs to be practiced, and while you can practice it on your own, it's way more effective when you can practice it together. And maybe this is a moment for students against gun violence to speak about what you're trying to organize, because you were moved as well, and Dr. Leonard, who I know is passionate about this idea. And,
I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about us because we've kind of been blasting your Facebook walls and stuff. And for those who are from other schools, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Amir, Sarah, Gia, Sam, and then we have a couple other members who are here today. And this is our lovely faculty advisor. He's very dedicated, Dr. Leonard. So basically what we tried to establish is a group at Rush called Students Against Gun Violence, where we're just trying to raise awareness, trying to build. We're coming at it at three angles right now, and it's raising awareness, involving Rush somehow, maybe changing some of Rush protocol, what doctors do in the rooms, if there's brochures in waiting rooms about how to store your gun, like how to, just any information, and getting involved in the community. So we're trying to go about it those three angles, and we're pretty new. Started a couple months ago. Our constitution is submitted and waiting to be approved. But we've already established some things already, and we're soon to talk to the Diversity Leadership Council at Rush and kind of present what we want to get accomplished. And another thing that goes back to what Jamie was saying is building that dialogue and breaking down those language barriers. One thing that we've pretty much already got set up is we've established a connection with the trauma group at Cook County, where they have a trauma interventional program for pediatric patients who come in victims of gunshot wounds. And what they do is that they try and get involved as soon as they can with these kids and intervene, and they have these weekly therapy sessions with these kids who most of them are suffering from PTSD and basically what they're trying to do is prevent them from retaliating, prevent them from getting back in the same environment and not wanting to just be a part of it. And basically what we're able to do is have students get involved and sit in on those therapy sessions. If they're volunteering at Cook County, be with the interventional team when they go and see these kids. And again, like Jamie said, I think that's a really good way of just starting to understand where these kids are coming from. Because a lot of these kids, maybe they were in a gang, maybe they weren't. Maybe they were just shot on the side of the street, you know? Like, you just don't know. And I think a lot of people come into med school, they have these preconceived notions, like, oh, this kid was just in a gang, like, whatever, who cares? But what we're trying to do is kind of break that, stop that, and yeah. So that's kind of what we got, and we've only been around for a couple months, but we're looking to grow. We're looking for new members. So if you guys are interested, even from other schools, you can contact me, contact any one of us, and we'll be look for emails from us. Do you guys want to add anything? I don't know. I kind of mumbled for.
But yeah, we really do want to connect with UIC, so if you guys want to reach out to us, we'd love to work with you guys.
Do you want the kids to do it?